Have you ever noticed how people from a certain age group can be incredibly self-reliant, almost suspicious of hype, deeply loyal to a small circle, and yet oddly allergic to being told what to do? They'll figure things out themselves, thank you very much. They don't need a tutorial. They don't trust trends. And if something breaks, their first instinct isn't to replace it. It's to fix it. We often describe this group with a shrug and a label, Gen X. The middle child generation. The forgotten one sandwiched between boomers and millennials. But psychologically, there's nothing forgettable about them. In fact, Gen X may be one of the most quietly influential personality shifts in modern history. To understand them, you don't start with personality tests or workplace statistics. You start with context. Because psychology is never just about who you are. It's about what shaped you when your brain was still wiring itself. Imagine growing up in a world where independence wasn't a philosophy. It was logistics. If you were born between roughly 1965 and 1980, you came of age during a time of enormous cultural transition. Divorce rates were climbing. Dual-income households were becoming the norm. Parents were working longer hours. The phrase latchkey kid didn't sound dramatic then. It sounded ordinary. You got home from school, unlocked the door, maybe made yourself a snack, maybe watched TV, maybe wandered the neighborhood until the streetlights came on. There wasn't a constant stream of adult supervision or scheduled enrichment. There was space, sometimes too much of it. Now here's where psychology gets interesting. Developmental research shows that children build their internal sense of safety not only from affection, but from predictability and presence. Many Gen X kids received love, but they also received something else in large doses. Autonomy before they were emotionally ready to label it that way. So their brains adapted. When a child repeatedly solves problems alone, navigates boredom alone, manages emotions alone, the nervous system begins to encode a simple rule. I handle things myself. Not because no one cares. Because that's how life works. Over time, that rule becomes identity. This is why so many Gen X adults appear remarkably self-sufficient. They're not performing independence. They internalized it decades ago. Psychologists sometimes call this an early developed internal locus of control, meaning you believe outcomes depend largely on what you do rather than what others provide. That mindset can create resilience, creativity, and adaptability. It also means asking for help can feel strangely unnatural, even when help is available. Now layer in the cultural atmosphere of the 1970s and 1980s. Economic uncertainty. Rapid technological change. The Cold War humming in the background. Institutions that once felt solid suddenly looking less so. When trust in systems becomes shaky during formative years, the brain compensates by trusting something else. Personal competence. Cynicism, even. A kind of emotional shrug that says, I'll believe it when I see it. That's why Gen X humor often leans sarcastic. Why their skepticism can feel almost reflexive. It's not negativity. It's pattern recognition shaped by unpredictability. If you grew up watching promises fail or structures shift, you learn not to anchor your identity to them. But here's the paradox. While Gen X is often described as detached or cynical, studies on midlife social behavior suggest they form intensely loyal, long-term bonds. Fewer friendships, maybe, but deeper ones. Psychologically, this makes sense. When your early environment teaches you not to rely broadly, you invest selectively. Trust becomes something earned, not assumed. Think of it like growing up learning to carry your own backpack everywhere. You don't mind carrying weight. You just become very careful about what you put inside. Technology adds another fascinating layer. Gen X is the last generation to remember a fully analog childhood, and the first to adapt to a digital adulthood. Their brains developed before the internet, but their careers demanded they learn it. That creates what psychologists call cognitive bridging, the ability to translate between two entirely different systems of thinking. They remember encyclopedias and search engines, landlines and smartphones, waiting and instant access. That dual exposure often produces a mental flexibility that doesn't get talked about enough. Gen X didn't grow up expecting rapid change, but they survived it anyway, over and over. This can create a kind of quiet confidence. Not flashy optimism. More like, we've handled worse. We'll figure this out too. At the same time, adapting to relentless technological acceleration later in life can also produce fatigue. Neuroscience tells us that the brain prefers stability once its core identity is formed. Being asked to constantly update skills, tools, and expectations can feel less like excitement and more like permanent recalibration. So when people joke that Gen X just wants to be left alone, there's a psychological truth hiding inside the humor. After decades of adapting, solving, and self-managing, solitude doesn't feel like isolation. It feels like recovery. And yet, that independence also carries invisible emotional complexity. Because when you learn early not to depend too much on others, you may also learn not to show vulnerability easily. Not because you don't feel deeply, because expressing need was never strongly reinforced. This is why many Gen Zers became what family therapists sometimes call competent adapters. The reliable one. The calm one in a crisis. The person who handles things without making noise about it. It's a strength. It's also a role that can be hard to step out of. If you've ever known someone who insists they're fine while juggling far too much, you may be seeing that pattern in action. And all of this is happening beneath the surface while Gen X moves through adulthood, raising families, managing careers, navigating a culture that suddenly became louder, faster, and more performative than the one they grew up in. So the real question isn't just who Gen X is. It's how this blend of early independence, cultural transition, and adaptive resilience shaped the way they see work, relationships, and meaning itself. Because once you understand that foundation, a lot of their behavior stops looking mysterious. It starts looking logical, and in many ways deeply human. Let's go deeper into how this upbringing shaped their approach to work, ambition, and why Gen X often defines success very differently from the generations before and after them. If you want to understand how Gen X approaches work, you have to rewind again to what they witnessed before they ever entered the workforce themselves. This was the generation that watched the idea of the lifetime job begin to erode. They saw parents get laid off from companies they had given decades to. They watched industries restructure, pensions disappear, and loyalty between employer and employee become less of a mutual pact and more of a transaction. Now imagine being a teenager or young adult absorbing that reality while your brain is forming beliefs about stability and effort. Psychology calls this observational learning. You don't need to experience something directly for it to shape your expectations. Watching it is enough. So Gen X walked into adulthood with a quieter, more pragmatic contract in mind. Work hard, yes. Be competent, absolutely. But don't assume the system will take care of you. Take care of yourself. That's why many Gen X professionals value autonomy more than recognition. They don't necessarily want applause. They want control over how they do their work. Micromanagement doesn't just annoy them. It can feel like a violation of the independence they learned early on. This also explains their complicated relationship with corporate culture. They can be deeply committed employees, but they're rarely emotionally attached to institutions. To them, work is something you do well, not something that defines your entire identity. When psychologists study motivation across generations, Gen X often falls into a category called instrumental engagement. Work is important, but it's a tool for building a life, not the center of meaning itself. That's a subtle but powerful distinction. They came of age during the rise of the phrase work-life balance, not as a trendy slogan, but as a survival adjustment. Many of them had already experienced what happens when work consumes everything, because they saw it happen to their parents. So they became the generation that quietly started leaving the office on time, coaching their kids' teams, fixing things around the house on weekends, and drawing boundaries before boundaries were something people talked about openly. And yet, they rarely announced those priorities. Gen X is not a generation known for broadcasting its values. If anything, they tend to understate them. There's a psychological term called self-effacing resilience, where individuals endure and adapt without making their struggle central to their identity. That description fits remarkably well here. Gen X doesn't usually frame itself as heroic. It just keeps going. Now let's talk about relationships, because this is where some of the most misunderstood aspects of Gen X psychology show up. Remember that early independence? It doesn't disappear in adulthood. It reshapes how closeness is experienced. Many Gen X adults value relationships deeply, but they often express care through action rather than constant communication. They'll help you move, fix your car, show up when things fall apart. But they might not text you every day. Emotion, for them, is often practical. This can create fascinating generational misunderstandings. Younger generations, raised in a culture of continuous digital connection, may interpret that lower-frequency contact as distance. But psychologically, Gen X often equates reliability with love. If they're there when it matters, that's connection. Attachment researchers sometimes describe this as a blend of secure functioning with avoidant habits. Not avoidant in the sense of rejecting closeness, but in the sense of not needing constant reassurance to maintain it. Their nervous systems learned early that relationships can exist without continuous feedback. And then there's their relationship with culture itself. Gen X grew up before personal branding was a concept, before social media turned identity into something performative. So many of them developed what psychologists call a private self-concept. Who you are is something you live, not something you curate publicly. This is why Gen X can appear less visible online, less invested in broadcasting milestones, less interested in turning every experience into content. It's not that they don't value those experiences. It's that their sense of meaning was formed in a world where moments didn't require witnesses to be real. There's something psychologically grounding about that. It fosters intrinsic validation, where satisfaction comes from the experience itself rather than the response to it. Of course, this also means Gen X sometimes feels out of sync with a culture that rewards visibility and speed. Their strengths, patience, skepticism, independence, depth, don't always translate into environments optimized for immediacy and self-promotion. But here's where their adaptive nature shows up again. They adjust. They learn the new systems. Maybe with a sigh. Maybe with a joke about how things used to work. But they do it. That blend of resistance and adaptation is one of their defining psychological signatures. They don't chase change, but they endure it remarkably well. And now, many Gen Zers find themselves in midlife, a developmental stage psychologists associate with reflection and integration. This is when people naturally start asking quieter questions. What mattered? What didn't? What do I want the next decades to look like? For a generation that spent so much time being self-reliant, this phase can be both liberating and disorienting. When you've always been the one holding things together, it can take time to ask what you need for yourself. But it's also where Gen X's strengths become incredibly valuable. Their tolerance for ambiguity, their ability to function without constant validation, their comfort operating outside of trends. These traits make them surprisingly well-equipped for redefining purpose on their own terms. And that brings us to something essential. Gen X may not always dominate cultural conversations, but psychologically, they serve as a bridge generation. They connect analog endurance with digital adaptation, institutional skepticism with personal responsibility, independence with loyalty. They are, in many ways, translators between worlds. So what does that mean for how they see meaning, aging, and legacy now? That's where the story gets even more interesting, because Gen X isn't just navigating change anymore. They're starting to shape how the next phase of adulthood itself is defined. Let's explore that. As Gen X moves further into midlife, something subtle but powerful begins to happen psychologically. The same people who once defined themselves by adaptability now begin shifting toward intentionality. Earlier in life, much of their energy went into responding to change, figuring things out on their own, and staying steady through uncertainty. But midlife, according to developmental psychologists, is less about reacting and more about choosing. Not choosing in a dramatic, cinematic way. Choosing in small, deliberate recalibrations. This is the stage Erik Erikson described as the tension between generativity and stagnation. Generativity isn't just about raising children, though many Gen Zers did that while juggling careers and economic shifts. It's about contributing something that outlasts you. Mentoring. Creating. Stabilizing systems. Leaving behind something functional, not flashy. And Gen X tends to approach this not with grand declarations, but with practicality. They build things. They fix what's broken. They pass along hard-earned knowledge, often casually, sometimes without even realizing they're doing it. A conversation at work. Advice given without ceremony. Showing someone how to solve a problem rather than talking about it endlessly. There's a quiet satisfaction in that kind of contribution. It aligns with what psychologists call mastery orientation. The reward comes not from recognition, but from competence and usefulness. For a generation that grew up learning to rely on themselves, being able to help others become capable can feel like a natural extension of identity. At the same time, Gen X is also confronting a cultural landscape that suddenly seems very loud. Rapid technological change. Constant discourse. Endless updates about how people are supposed to live, think, optimize, improve. For many Gen X adults, this creates an interesting psychological contrast. They remember a time when identity developed more slowly, without constant comparison. So they may find themselves both participating in and quietly resisting the speed of modern life. This resistance isn't necessarily stubbornness. It can be understood through cognitive pacing. The brain adapts to the rhythm it was trained in. Gen X developed its sense of meaning in longer feedback cycles. You worked on something for years before seeing results. You formed relationships without constant microcommunication. You learned skills through repetition, not instant tutorials. That pacing shaped neural expectations about effort and reward. So when everything accelerates, they often respond by becoming more selective rather than faster. They don't try to absorb every new thing. They ask, sometimes bluntly, does this actually matter? That filtering ability can look like disengagement from trends, but psychologically it's closer to value consolidation. Over time, people refine what deserves attention. Gen X is at a life stage where novelty is less compelling than usefulness and authenticity. And here's where another shift emerges. Earlier independence can soften into something more reflective. Many Gen Zers begin reconnecting not because they suddenly crave constant socializing, but because they now have the internal stability to engage without feeling consumed by it. Developmental research shows that as people age, emotional regulation improves. The nervous system becomes less reactive, more capable of holding complexity. In other words, the same generation that once prided itself on not needing much from others may begin rediscovering connection on different terms. Not as dependency, as mutuality. They may call friends less often, but the conversations get deeper. They may narrow their circles, but invest more meaningfully in those relationships. This reflects what psychologists call socio-emotional selectivity theory. As people become more aware of time as finite, they prioritize emotionally meaningful interactions over expansive networks. Quality over quantity. Depth over breadth. It's not withdrawal. It's refinement. There's also a quiet reckoning happening beneath the surface. Gen X grew up in an era that often celebrated toughness and emotional self-sufficiency. But as conversations about mental health have become more open, many are reevaluating what strength actually means. Not abandoning resilience, but expanding it to include reflection, vulnerability, and rest. This can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. Yet it represents psychological flexibility, the ability to revise old survival strategies when they're no longer necessary. The same adaptability that helped them navigate latchkey childhoods, economic shifts, and technological revolutions now helps them renegotiate their inner lives. And perhaps that's one of the most underappreciated aspects of Gen X psychology. They are remarkably good at reinvention without spectacle. They don't always announce transformations. They just make adjustments, gradually, pragmatically, until life fits better. If you look closely, you'll see it everywhere. Career pivots made quietly in their 40s or 50s. New hobbies learned without turning them into side hustles. Parenting styles that consciously differ from what they experienced. A deliberate effort to offer their children both freedom and support, trying to strike a balance they themselves rarely had. They are, in many ways, an experimental generation. Not loudly experimental, like some cultural movements, but structurally experimental, constantly recalibrating how to live between independence and connection, skepticism and hope, endurance and meaning. And that brings us to a perspective shift that often gets lost in generational stereotypes. Gen X is sometimes labeled as cynical. But psychologically, what looks like cynicism can actually be adaptive realism. They learned early not to assume systems would hold. So they developed trust in individuals, in skills, in relationships that prove themselves over time. It's less nothing matters and more show me what works. That mindset can be grounding in a world that often swings between hype and despair. Gen X tends to anchor itself somewhere in the middle, where life is imperfect but manageable, uncertain but navigable. So if you're a part of this generation, or if you're trying to understand someone who is, it helps to see the pattern beneath the personality. The independence wasn't detachment. It was training. The skepticism wasn't apathy. It was protection. The adaptability wasn't aimlessness. It was survival in a rapidly changing world. And now, many Gen Zers are entering a phase where those same traits can finally be used less for coping and more for crafting a life that actually reflects who they are. If this resonates with you, take a moment to notice which parts of that story feel familiar. The self-reliance, the quiet resilience, the tendency to figure things out without asking for much credit. These aren't just personal quirks. They're psychological imprints from a very specific cultural moment. And understanding them can be surprisingly freeing. Because once you see the pattern, you can decide which parts you want to keep, which ones you want to soften, and which ones you're ready to outgrow. If you'd like to keep exploring how generational experiences shape the way we think, relate, and adapt over time, stay curious and stay with me. The human mind is always telling a story. Sometimes we just need to slow down enough to hear it.